Howdy folks, and welcome back to Workshop Wednesday, where today I am going to be assembling and painting this bad boy, the Warhammer 40,000 Macharius Vulcan tank, available from Forgeworld for the very reasonable and not at all extortionate amount of £126. Well, I say available from Forgeworld, nothing's available from Forgeworld at the moment, for what should be fairly obvious reasons, but equally obviously, I ordered a bunch of stuff before everything went into lockdown, so let's take a look at what's inside the Forgeworld box. Obviously there's going to be a tank, but that's not all. So, we have a Cadian Command Headquarters unit with a scanner. We have Cadian Infantry upgrade packs, so backpacks, bedrolls, bayonets, all kinds of bits and pieces there for my Imperial Guard. Oh, this was, Imperial Heavy Mortars, 3 of them. I'm going to make a mortar battery. I want to dig out the firing pits. Here's the crew, or as best as I could get. I want to do a diorama of a mortar battery, dig out the firing pits and the communication trenches and all that sort of thing. I was thinking of maybe building it around something like this, also from Forgeworld, and also in resin. But yeah, that's all way down the line. You came here to see a big dink, and there it is. Occupies most of the box. So what does 126 pounds of resin look like? And when I say pounds, I don't mean weight. Although actually, you know, it is a pretty heavy model once put together. Forgeworld include instructions for working with resin. Read them carefully, by the way, particularly the part about washing your resin model. Early Forgeworld kits didn't come with instructions, and these aren't great instructions, but they're better than nothing. To be fair, there aren't a huge amount of parts, and it should be fairly obvious where everything goes. So the first pack contains all of the extra bits, some of them optional, like the crew and the pintle-mounted heavy stubber. Other parts, like the exhaust, not quite so optional. And here's the turret. Notice that great big wodge of resin out the back. You're probably not going to get through that with a hobby knife. You're going to need a saw or a Dremel. It's pretty much the same with the other main parts of the tank. Here's the main section of the hull. Just get it out of the bubble wrap. You can see the turret ring there where the turret goes, and at the front another honking dirty great big piece of resin. This part you should be able to cut off with a hobby knife. Only another 3 main bits left. This is the underside of the hull. There it is. Again, you should be able to cut that resin block off with a hobby knife. And we have the 2 track pieces. And yeah, you're going to need a Dremel or a saw to get that block off. And there's another one there as well. So those are the bits. So, first things first, cut all of the exposed bits of resin off. Wash every part in warm soapy water, because if you don't do that, some of the chemicals used in the casting process may still be on the model, and if that's the case, it's going to be impossible to get paint to stick to the surface. It's also an extremely good idea at this stage in the process to go and dry fit everything to ensure that it all fits together, because it almost certainly won't. There's going to be some filing and sanding and possibly some bending that you're going to have to do. The sponsons needed to be filed in order to fit properly to the side of the hull, and the underbody didn't actually fit. It was slightly warped, which was easily fixed because you can actually work with resin if you heat it. And so I just filled a sink full of hot water and immersed the underbody of the tank for a good 5 minutes, which made it quite pliable, and I was able to bend it back into the correct shape. Even then, there were still some gaps that had to be filled with modelling putty, so it's a good idea to do all of this before you start gluing bits together that you can't easily unglue later in order to fix any mistakes. Oh, and speaking of glue, you're going to need super glue, or epoxy resin, but not plastic cement, not regular modelling glue, because while resin is a plastic, it's the wrong kind of plastic. And oh, we have a visitor. Mikazuki's come to help. Never work with children or animals. Right, anyway. I'll just remind you once again, because it's probably the most important stage in working with resin. Wash it in warm soapy water. Give it a good scrub with a toothbrush. Because the chemicals used in the moulding process, if they haven't been properly removed from the surface of the resin, they actually act as a paint retarder. You will not get paint to stick to any kind of surfaces that still have any of the moulding compound on them. So wash your resin before you try to apply a primer. Like the Citadel Death Guard green primer that I've used from a spray can here. So here are the bits all primed. Obviously I've also stuck all of the extra bits and pieces on, like the pintle mounted heavy stubber, the commander and driver's hatches, the hull mounted heavy stubber and its armour plate, the fuel tanks and the exhausts. And with that done and dried, it's time to apply the undercoat. And because I'm going to be using chipping fluid for the first time, the choice of actual undercoat colour is going to be very, very important. And I've boiled it down to 3 choices. 2 from Vallejo and 1 from AK Interactive. First, the good old Vallejo Model Air Hull Red. This is the red oxide undercoat that you often see on actual tanks. Solid choice. Next, Vallejo Model Air Rust. Now this is a metallic colour and I think it might be a little bit too much. So probably not going to use this. Finally, and this is the one I'm probably going to go for other reasons, which will become obvious in a moment, AK Interactive's very imaginatively titled Chipping Colour. And the reason I'm probably going to go with this is because this is exactly what it's designed for, and I'm going to be using AK Interactive chipping fluid. I've got worn effects and heavy chipping fluid. And don't worry, I'll explain how all this works in a moment. But if I'm using AK Interactive chipping fluid, I may as well use AK Interactive chipping colour, because they came in a set, they're specifically designed to work with each other. Now you can just paint this stuff on, but obviously it's going to be a lot faster and more efficient if you have access to an airbrush. If you don't have access to an airbrush, then you're going to be using the old Mark I paintbrush, which will work, but it's just going to take longer. And here's the finished result with the chipping colour undercoat applied to all of the major parts. The next thing that I'm going to do is apply the chipping fluid, but before I do that, because of the way chipping fluid works, or because of the amount of time that you have to work with chipping fluid, I need to figure out now what colour base coat I'm going to apply over the chipping fluid once it's dried. So I've narrowed it down to a couple of choices. I've got a whole selection of Vallejo Model Air colours here, most of which I've never actually used before, and so I don't really know exactly what they look like, and it can be difficult to tell just from looking at the bottle. So I'm doing a dab test here, just a little drop of colour onto a clean piece of tissue paper, just to see how it looks. These are all various different shades of green. We've got medium olive here, for example. I'm not really expecting any big surprises here, because we all know what olive green looks like, right? Except that's pretty dark. Wow, if that's medium olive, I don't want to know what dark olive looks like. So this is why I'm testing the colours out before I put them on the model. Most of these colours I've never used before. I don't know what they actually look like. From the Panzer set, here's grey-green. And it looks more brown to me. I like the colour. I suppose you could get away with calling that green, but yeah. But this is why I'm testing the colours out first. What do we have next? Come on, Jingles, get it in shot. There we go. Dark grey-green. Alright. I mean, the first grey-green was kind of dark. Not seeing a huge amount of difference between that and the medium olive. I mean, there's a subtle difference, but it is very, very subtle. So I kept going through the colours until I found one that I really, really like the look of. This is Vallejo Model Air's US Air Force Olive Green. And I really, really like that colour. It's very browny green. It's very similar to the The third colour I tested, the Panzer grey-green. But I think again, not much of a difference, very subtle difference, but I kind of prefer the US Air Force olive green. I think I'm going to use that. So now that I've made my choice of base coat colour, it's time to get that chipping fluid over the undercoat. Now, I've watched videos of people doing this, I've read about it, but I've never actually done it myself. You can actually use a can of lacquer hairspray, and apparently it produces exactly the same results, but I've got actual chipping fluid, so I'm going to use actual chipping fluid. The way this works, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the process, like me, like I said, never done this before, is, well, I've applied my undercoat of AK Interactive chipping colour. I could have used Vallejo's Whole Red, but this is what I've gone with. This is the colour that is going to show through the chips in your base coat, that US Air Force olive drab. This colour here is what's going to be visible through the damage that we're going to inflict on the top coat of paint. And this is all going to be achieved through the magic of chipping fluid. So this is going to sit in a layer between the undercoat of chipping colour and the top coat of US Air Force olive drab. Actually, you know what? I mean, I don't actually understand the process. Well, I understand the process, but I don't know how it works. I just know that it does. And it's probably easier just to show you than me attempt to explain something that I don't actually fully understand. So here we go. Once the chipping fluid is dried, it's time to put that base coat on. So this is our US Air Force olive green, as previously advertised. Actually, olive drab. We're going to be completely correct about it. You've never worried about that before, Jingles. Quiet you. Once that top coat's had time to dry, you've got about 20 minutes to work with the chipping fluid underneath the top coat, and you're going to activate that chipping fluid by the simple method of taking a brush dipped in plain old water and just brushing over the areas that you want to chip. I think the way it works is because acrylic paints are water-based paints. So what I'm doing by applying water to the top coat is I'm wetting the top coat up again, and that's activating the chipping fluid underneath, which is allowing me to brush away sections of the top coat. I'm sure there's some relatively straightforward chemical process that explains why it works. I don't understand that chemical process. I'm just happy that it works, as you can see. I'm surprised how well it does work, actually, because like I said, I've never done this before. You can use a toothpick or a cocktail stick to do more precise weathering. I think I might have ended up slightly overdoing it. But like I said, this is my first attempt. It's all part of the learning process. This isn't the only way of applying chipping to a model, by the way. This is probably the easiest way of doing it. You can just do it the old-fashioned way and actually paint the chipping on over the top of the base coat. The downside is that doing it that way is obviously going to take a lot longer and is going to require a lot more skill. The upside of this is that if you're good enough, it does allow you much more precise and delicate control over exactly where and how big the chipping is going to be. Much more so than, well, in my limited experience so far at least, than by using the chipping fluid method. Although I suppose it's entirely possible that if you get enough practice in at this method and you use a small enough brush or even a toothpick, you can probably achieve comparable results using the chipping fluid method. It's probably worth pointing out, I mean I did mention it earlier, but you don't have to go to the expense of buying chipping fluid in order to employ this technique. Hairspray works apparently just as well. I say apparently because I've never used hairspray. This is the first time I've done it, and I'm using chipping fluid. Once you've done all of your chipping, there is one final vitally important step that you must do, and that's to varnish everything, to seal all of that chipping in, because remember that chipping fluid is activated by water, and acrylic paints are water-based paints. So if you're trying to do any additional weathering on top of the chipping that you've done, there's a good chance you're going to reactivate the chipping fluid. and you don't want to do that. So once you've finished doing the chipping, get yourself a nice coat of varnish over absolutely everything in order to seal all of that work in and allow you to continue working over the top of it. And here's the finished result. Well, the finished result of the chipping and varnishing at least. There's still a way to go on this model. When I was actually doing the chipping and everything was wet, you might have thought that the difference between the chipped areas and the top-coated areas was a bit extreme. But that's always the case when things are still wet. You never really know what things are going to look like until the paint's had a chance to dry out a bit. And now that it has dried out and I've applied a coat of matte varnish over the top of everything, the difference is actually quite subtle. I mean, you can still see it, but it's no longer nearly as extreme as it looked when everything was wet. So what we've effectively done thus far is just remove some top coat paint from the more heavily weathered areas of the tank. Now what would happen then in real life is that that's where rust would start to collect. So that's what we're doing now. I'm painting some rust onto the most heavily exposed areas of chipping. And I'm not just covering up all of the areas that have been chipped with rust paint. You have to think about where that rust is going to accumulate, because rust is caused by the oxidization of metal with oxygen. That's why it's called oxidization. And it happens mostly when that metal comes into contact with water, and water tends to pool at the edges and at the bottom of flat surfaces. And if that flat surface is anything approaching a vertical surface, it's going to pool up at the edge and then streak down that vertical surface. So that's where you want to apply the rust and the rust streaks. And by the way, you may have noticed I have fixed the twin heavy stubbers. They were very badly misaligned, but this is the next day, and overnight I stuck a block of blue tack in between the guns, and that was enough to sort them out and get them back into the correct alignment. I do apologise. I realise that those misaligned heavy stubbers in that front hull turret has probably been triggering the shit out of people. But I fixed it now, okay? After doing the rusting and a little bit of detailing, including some of the Imperial Eagles and also the unit marking at the front section of the side track armour panels, that was a particular pain in the arse to do, because I had to try to simulate the weathering that had already gone on underneath it. I didn't want it to go on nice and clean. That would have just looked completely out of place. It had to look as if it had undergone the same level of weathering as the rest of the paint on the tank. And I did that by basically only painting over the areas where the US Air Force olive drab hadn't been chipped, and then over the borders between the top coat and the chipping, applying a very, very light glaze, a watered down mix of the top coat colours that I was applying, the red and the white. The white ended up looking more like a whitewash, which was perfect because it's supposed to be something that would have been applied in the field by the troops rather than a factory paint job. And again, like so many things with this model, this is something that I'd never actually tried before, but I'm pretty happy with the results. Next, some detail work on the engine and the exhausts before I get busy dirtying it all up. This is going to be fun. And I'm trying something new here as well. Well, I'm trying a paint I haven't used before. It's a Citadel technical paint. It's called Typhus Corrosion, and it's basically rust in a bottle. Citadel's technical paints really are very, very good. I mean, you've seen in other videos when I've used the Sterland Battlemire technical paint, which is basically just dark, thick mud. And this Typhus Corrosion is as good, if not better. I mean, instant rust and corrosion effects straight out of the bottle. I'd love nothing more than to be able to take credit for the finished look of this exhaust. But it's all the paint. It's not me. The exhaust, of course, would be one of the most heavily rusted parts of the tank because it would get very, very hot and the paint would just flake right off. I am not quite done with the Typhus Corrosion paint, however. For my next trick, I'm employing a technique that I learned from other YouTube scale model makers, like the amazing Plasmo, Night Shift, and Andy's Hobby Headquarters. And I'm going to be taking a brush loaded with some of this Typhus Corrosion, and then using a cocktail stick and just flicking it in a random pattern over the surface of the model. This is probably the easiest way of achieving this effect, although you do need to be careful not to overdo it. You could achieve the same effect in a more controlled fashion by doing stippling. This would involve taking a piece of foam, like the packing material that a lot of these models come in, or failing that, just a piece of kitchen sponge for example, breaking off a small edge, dipping it in the paint and then drying most of it off, and then using the rough edge of the sponge loaded up with the paint and just, well, stippling it, just dabbing it over the surface where you want the rust spots to be. I kind of like this effect though, because it's a lot easier and it's also a lot more random. Once again, of course, Akazuki chooses the worst possible moment to try to come to my assistance. What are you doing, cat? Can't you see Daddy's busy? Come on. Oh, she's got some bits of grass stuck in her ass for... she's been out in the garden. Go on, Akazuki. Daddy doesn't need your help. Next, let's get some mud down on this thing. And that mostly means the tracks and the sides of the track assemblies. So I'm going to be using two further Citadel technical paints for this. The first is called Agrellan Earth, and it goes down while wet, looking like a sort of very thick wet mud, but when it dries it tends to crack and does a very nice dried mud effect. Once I've applied that to both sets of tracks, and while I'm waiting for it to dry, I'm not entirely happy with the rusting around some of the bigger areas of the tank hull itself. So I'm going to be using some of this Vallejo pigment binder with some weathering pigments. No, that's the wrong one. Where is it? I got some weathering pigments from Forgeworld. Here we go. Aged rust weathering powder. These pigments are basically just paint, but without the liquid. It's next to impossible to use this stuff without making some kind of a mess. And if you've ever dealt with photocopier toner, you know exactly the kind of mess I'm talking about. You can dab this stuff on with a dry brush and then use that brush to try to manipulate it. You can then, well, there's two different ways of fixing it in place. You can either use the pigment binder, but that's adding a lot of liquid to it and can give you a muddy effect, which isn't necessarily what you're going to be looking for. Or, once you've applied it and you're happy with how it looks, airbrush some varnish over the top of it. Here I'm doing pretty much exactly the same thing, using the black soot weathering powder around the Megabolter gun barrels, just to give it that these guns have been fired a lot and cooked the barrel shrouds kind of effect. There are a lot of modelers out there who don't like doing this. They think it's a bit of a noob move, but well, it's my model, I like it. Tough. Anyway, the tracks have dried. Now it's time to get some real dirty mud on there. This is the world famous Sterland Battlemire, yet another Citadel technical paint, and one that I've used extensively on previous tank models, because this stuff really is amazingly good. It's not just, I mean, look at the texture. It is literally mud in a bottle. You can wipe this stuff on quite thinly and it acts like any other paint colour, even if it is a little bit gritty, but you can also pile it on thick and you get the most amazing mud effect. It's particularly useful not just for the tracks of tanks, but also for around the suspension, although there isn't any suspension on the Macharius Vulcan here. But around the tracks, well, there is suspension on it, but you can't see it because it's hidden behind the armour plates and the skirts. But you know what I mean. But I'm definitely going to be slapping this on all over. I know I'm singing the praises of these Citadel technical paints quite a bit, but they really are amazingly good. And I'm sure that other manufacturers do their own similar types of technical paint that are as good or possibly even better, but I haven't used them, so I can't comment on them. I can tell you that if you're looking for effects like this, Citadel technical paints are very good. And here is the almost, but not quite finished result, because we still have to do the crew. And there's a little bit of cleanup work that does need to be done. I mean, I realise that saying cleanup work on something that's designed to look as muddy as this is probably not the best choice of words, but some of the red around the headlights has bled into the headlight fittings, so that sort of thing needs to be cleaned up. But other than that, we're pretty much done, except for the crew. There are only 2 crew and they're entirely optional. You can build the model with the hatches shut, but I've built them with the hatches open. So we have 2 Death Corps of Krieg crewmen, 1 driver and 1 commander. And the commander has a choice of 2 arms. You can either have him pointing, move me closer, I want to hit them with my sword, or have him actually holding onto the pintle-mounted heavy stubber. I've decided to go with the classic move me closer, I want to hit them with my sword pose, mostly because I don't trust myself to be able to get the arms to connect up to the hand grips of the heavy stubber without absolutely ruining everything. So, here it is. Took about 2 days. There's definitely room for improvement. There always is. But I'm pretty happy with the results. A lot of techniques I've never tried before, which ended up being quite successful. And further refinement of existing techniques that I've used before. So we're going to leave you with some glamour shots. I hope you've enjoyed the video in the process. I've certainly enjoyed painting this beast of a tank. And as always, stay safe, take care, and I'll catch you next time.